friends, we meet again. Rob Caskie, proudly engaging in storytelling and sharing these stories on Patreon, which I hope you're enjoying. I want to tell you a little this morning about a remarkable fellow called George Chops Mossop, who was born and raised in the Greytown and Vulture area of Natal. He had a charmed upbringing, spent most of his life barefooted. He and his friends would go out and fish and swim and hunt, climb trees, collect birds' eggs, the sort of lives that many rural South African lads dream of leading. He clearly learned to speak Zulu extremely well. I think was a fluent Zulu linguist. School did not appeal much to him, and by the age of 14 he decided to take off to the Transvaal and join up with a rather rough group of Boers, Dutch hunters and farmers who travelled the open veld, who made a living largely out of trading of skins, ivory, meat and biltong. And they had with them a tough bushman, a sand fellow called Geswent. And Geswent loved Chops and Chops loved Geswent, and Geswent spoke very good English, and he and Chops became firm friends. It was interesting that Geswent, whenever he felt threatened or challenged by Chops, would often just drop his head and run at him like a bull and hit him in the solar plexus with his head and knock the wind right out of Chops. But one experience that I recall from these days out on the veld with these Boer hunters is that when they'd collected a lot of wildebeest, which they cut up for biltong, there were a lot of skins and meat and bones lying around the camp, and the vultures were a real issue. And Geswent said to Chops Mossop that he was going to hide under a fresh wildebeest skin, looking a bit like a wildebeest, and the vultures would come, and as soon as one came close enough, he was going to grab it by the leg. And he said when he grabbed that vulture by the leg, Chops Mossop had to come in with a sjambok and sjambok the bird, and it was going to give the other vultures the clear idea that this was not a safe place for them and to stay away. Well, Geswent, being of the Sand Nation, was a small fellow. Sure enough, a large vulture landed and came close enough to the skin immediately to start feeding, and Geswent grabbed this vulture by the leg and started screaming for support from Chops. Well, of course, the vulture was desperate to get away and was trying hard to pull itself along the ground and take off, almost lifting Geswent and the wildebeest skin off the ground. And Chops Mossop arrived with his sjambok, a bit nervous of the whole situation, and began to sjambok the bird, and in doing so, many of his strokes landed on Geswent. Geswent was unhappy about this, but their firm friendship continued. And it's interesting to note that these Boers were such accomplished horsemen and shots that they would often shoot running game from the saddle. And Chops Mossop just couldn't get it right. And one of the Boers took him under his wing, and they approached a herd of wildebeest, and they split the herd with the horses, and then they began to run closer and closer to the herd to shoot these wildebeest from the saddle. And this Boer was watching Chops very closely and realized all the mistakes that he was making, and he pointed him in the right direction regarding the seat, how loosely he sat in the saddle. Chops up to that point had sat far too tense. Chops wasn't leading. He wasn't giving the animal enough of a lead in terms of his shot for that vital region, either in the shoulder or just behind, in the heart and the lungs. And Chops said overnight, his shooting improved with the advice and the tuition of this Boer, for whom horsemanship and good shooting had been part of his life since he was a child. Well, at age 16 and a half, Chops Mossop joined up with a tough unit under the leadership of a man called Redvers Buller, called the Frontier Light Horse. The Frontier Light Horse featured prominently in the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879. And it's interesting to note that Buller and the Frontier Light Horse, who were really a collection of criminals, brigands, and mercenaries, who Buller had forged into a very effective fighting unit, were part of the assault on a mountain called Choban. Now, the Battle of Choban was planned by the British for the 28th of March of 1879 to take pressure away from the coastal column who'd been besieged at Ishawi and ended up besieged for 10 weeks, for 70 days by the Zulu army. And Chelmsford wanted to attract some of the Zulus away from the siege down in the coastal region and ease the pressure on the siege of Ishawi, that he could relieve that siege. And one of the decoys for relieving the pressure on Ishawi was an attack on the Choban mountain. Now, Choban had long been a stronghold of the Abakulusi people. The Abakulusi used to use the top of Choban as a grazing ground. It's an impressive mountain. It runs about 4 miles long, 6.5 kilometers long from west to east. It is surrounded on the southern and the northern side by very high cliffs. And the only approach routes to the top of the mountain are at the extreme eastern and western end of the mountain. The western end of the mountain has become known as the Devil's Pass. And Chops Mossop and the Frontier Light Horse approached the base of Choban the night before the battle. So the 27th of March of 1879, Chops Mossop was not yet 17 years of age. So really just a teenager. And they built up big fires to give the Zulus the impression that they were camping there. And then in the cover of darkness and silence, they moved off towards the eastern end of the mountain. And as they began to climb up Choban, the intention was for them to drive cattle, the Abakulusi cattle, from the eastern end of the mountain to the western end of the mountain, where another force was supposed to be waiting under a lieutenant colonel called Russell at the base of the Devil's Pass, and to Russell to steal these Abakulusi cattle. Well, it all began to go horribly wrong. A thunderstorm broke out, soaking the men within seconds to the skin. As these violent flashes of lightning began to illuminate their ascent, they came under fire from Abakulusi tribesmen who were lining the top of the mountain and were tucked away behind well-built palisades and skerms of rocks. There were a number of men and horses lost as they got to the top of the mountain, and they managed to drive off those Abakulusi tribesmen. And it was at this point that Buller went off to reconnoitre the top of the mountain towards the western end, and to see that Russell was in place at the base of the Devil's Pass, whilst Mossop and many of his men were assigned to holding the eastern end of the mountain with considerable Abakulusi tribesmen and activity around them. So they secured their horses in a little hollow of dead ground out of sight and came forward to the edge of the mountain and took up a position behind those very rocks that the Abakulusi had very shortly beforehand been firing at them from. Well, it wasn't long before somebody tapped Buller on the shoulder and said, "Sir, what's that?" And there was a huge dark shadow running in the early morning light towards the base of the mountain. It was part of the main Zulu army, probably 20,000 warriors strong, the sunlight glinting off their assegais. And as one, they parted in two and began to race for indeed the eastern and the western end of the mountain, the only place where the mountain could be ascended. The hunter had suddenly become the hunted. Well, it was desperate. Chops Mossop and his men were trying to fire at the Zulus climbing up the eastern end of the mountain under extreme pressure on account of the numbers. Weatherly's horse, under a colonel called Weatherly, had decided to try and fight their way off the eastern end of the mountain. Weatherly was unseated. His son, who was sadly mentally handicapped and only in his mid-teens, went back through the Zulus on his horse to try and rescue his father, and father and son died together. There were desperate scenes and a huge amount of fighting on those slopes at the eastern end of the Choban mountain on the Intendeka neck and the Intendeka slopes for men trying to get off to the north and to the south of the mountain. And isn't it tragic that Buller, who was indeed facing west when he gave the instruction, sent a message to Weatherly's men that they were to descend by the right of the mountain, which meant by the north of the mountain, since he was facing west. Well, Weatherly, when he got that message a handwritten message, was facing east, and by the right of the mountain meant to the south. And he, as a result of this tragic mistake, descended into the teeth of hell with this huge Zulu force that would overwhelm him and his men. Well, Chops Mossop, under the pressure from the Zulus of the Abakulusi, he and his men were eventually being overwhelmed. And they tell us that they fled like a covey of partridges to their horses, jumped on their horses, and began to gallop across that rocky mountain top towards the western end and the Devil's Pass. Now Chops was riding a Basotho pony called Warrior, who he loved. Warrior, he said, had 5 points, meaning that each of his hooves and his nose was dark. He was a bay animal, a brown animal with these black points, and he had a black line that ran down his mane and all the way along his spine to the root of his tail. Chops and Warrior loved one another. And Chops said that men and I became separated. We were all trying to find a way of escaping through the Zulus who'd effectively surrounded us and get to the western end of the mountain. And Chops said, I gave Warrior his head, and like a wild animal he seemed to bunch up underneath me. And he took off for what he perceived was a gap between some Zulu warriors, and as they lifted their spears, Warrior suddenly leapt at one of them, hitting him in the chest, and managed to burst through the line of Zulus, and onwards they fled towards the western end of the mountain. Well, the western end of the mountain, the Devil's Pass, is an incredible place. There are rocks and boulders that frequent that slope the size of houses. The pass itself was choked with men and horses trying to fight their way down through the Zulus. Lieutenant Cecil Russell and his men had not materialized at the base of the Devil's Pass. They were waiting some miles away off to the west in another tragic turn of events. Well, Chops Mossop felt that the pass was so incredibly choked that he decided to leave his horse at the top of the pass and make his way down this incredible slope of about 45 degrees to the bottom. An older man who he knew was standing next to him, and surrounded by Zulus, he felt that he would be better off to take his own life. And he placed his carbine in his mouth and blew his brains out. Chop said, I was splashed with the soft and spongy bits. It was horrific. Well, Chops Mossop got to the bottom of the Devil's Pass alive when he received a sound crack across the ear. It was Redvers Buller, who was a big man. And Buller said, where's your horse? And Mossop said, it's at the top of the pass, sir. And Buller said, you go back and fetch your horse immediately on foot. You will definitely be killed by the Zulus. And Chops Mossop now, this teenager, has to make his way back up through this choking mass of men, Zulus and colonial soldiers fighting hand to hand. Many of the colonials had turned their rifles around and were using them as clubs, trying to fight off the Zulus, with horses coming down in between, often breaking their legs on account of the rocks, trapping men underneath them. It was an indescribable scene. And Chops Mossop got to the top of the pass, and there his beloved, trusted pony Warrior was waiting for him. Well, Chops decided that the pass itself was completely impassable, and he took off on his little horse for a gap in the cliffs on the northern side of the Choban mountain, and launches himself and his horse through this gap in the cliffs, hoping for the best. Well, his horse immediately somersaulted. So Chops and the horse separate. Chops is now literally rolling down the side of a cliff with his horse rolling down alongside of him. And when Chops came to rest at the bottom, he was between two rocks. And as he was trying to get back to his feet, he was hit with an enormous force and weight above him. It was a dead horse. Well, he was saved by the rocks, that horse never crushed him to death. But he had a dreadful time trying to extricate himself from between the two rocks and from underneath this dead horse. Sure enough, Warrior was waiting for him. Warrior, in the fall and in the injuries, all 4 of his hooves were bleeding. Blood coming out from his fetlocks onto his hooves. His saddle had moved around to underneath his belly. His reins and bridle were broken. And Chops looked, and the saddle tree, which is metal on the saddles that they were using, had created a huge hole in the rib cage of his beloved horse Warrior. Well, there was nothing that Chops could do. He folded up his jacket, tried to pad the wound, put the saddle back in its correct position, made some adjustments to his bridle, and decided to take off for Kambola, a good 18 miles, nearly 30 kilometers away. And he said the horse was moving very gingerly and stiffly to begin with, and as with many of these animals, it began to loosen up and eventually was able to move from a lope into a trot. Well, they got back to Kambola. He took his horse to the horse lines and gave him some rations at which he only nibbled. Well, Chops Mossop was absolutely exhausted. He hadn't slept in more than 48 hours, and he went to his tent and collapsed, sleeping the sleep of the dead. During that night, Redvers Buller regularly went out on sorties to find men who were still out in the hills, many of them without a horse, trying to find their way back to Kambola. Well, Chops Mossop in the morning said, I rushed to the horse lines, and there my horse warrior lay. I thought at first him dead, but he was alive, just. And I lifted his head onto my lap, and I caressed his little silken ears. He whinnied twice and died. And Chops Mossop said, had I not got up and run off immediately, I would have blubbered right there in front of the horse guard. He was just a little Basotho pony, but he had a great heart, and he loved me. And indeed that horse had saved Chops Mossop's life in this incredible battle of Choban. Well, Mossop went on to fight through the Battle of Kambola the following day, the 29th of March of 1879, which was indeed the turning point of the Anglo-Zulu War. Having survived those two momentous battles, he was lucky enough indeed to get away alive out of both. He went on to fight in the first Transvaal War of Independence, or the first Anglo-Boer War of 1880-1881, which was only 1 year later. And Chops Mossop was absolutely staggered that his native guides, his Zulu guides, were employed by the British to lead the British from O'Neill's cottage all the way up onto the top of Mojuba in February of 1881, where indeed they were smashed. The erosion process in this country creates concave slopes, and if you're on the top of the mountain and people are approaching you from the bottom, for a great deal of their ascent, they are out of sight to those observing from the top of the mountain, and that indeed was the case at Mojuba. And instead of the British doing any sort of bayonet charging, the Boers were able to climb up the mountain on foot, having secured their horses halfway up the slope, and they led the charge. They were able to shoot General Sir George Pomeroy Colley, and eventually, along with the Naval Brigade and the 58th Regiment and others, they became helter-skelter off the back of Mojuba, running down towards O'Neill's cottage for their lives. And the British, including Buller and Wood, were forced to give the Transvaal its unequivocal independence and had to face the indignity of being spat at in the streets, where people were saying, you will allow this group of rough, tough, mounted farmers to effectively defeat the greatest empire the world has ever known, the British. Well, that situation only prevailed until 1886, with the discovery of gold in the Witwatersrand under George Harrison, and this huge influx of Uitlanders or Outlanders foreigners to South Africa, which eventually led to the outbreak of the main Boer War in October of 1899. Now, Chops Mossop had moved on to become a transport rider. And this really is where the charmed part of his life exists, because they would run transport wagons from Delagoa Bay and Lorenzo Marques down on the Mozambique coast, through Mozambique, up the escarpment, onto the Highveld to supply the gold mines in the greater Johannesburg area. And I want to tell you what, that life, as charmed as it may seem, was incredibly tough. They often had to trek with the oxen at night to avoid the dreaded tsetse fly, which caused trypanosomiasis or sleeping sickness. Many of the men succumbed to malaria on those lower coastal plains of Mozambique. The securing of the firewood was always an enormously difficult task, and quite often they had huge difficulty with many of their helpers succumbing to malaria and having to move wagons which they called hospital wagons. and then they'd have to build big barricades or skirms at night with thornbush to protect their oxen and their horses from the attentions of lions. And it's really this period of Chop's Mossop life that makes for the most wonderful, wonderful of reading. This book, called Running the Gauntlet, is really a autobiography by Chop's Mossop about his life, and it makes for some incredible reading. Very, very simply written about the life and times of Chop's Mossop, who left school at 14, joined up with the Frontier Light Horse at 16, was lucky enough as a teenager to survive both the Anglo-Zulu War and the first Transvaal War of Independence, including those battles of Laing's Neck, Ngogo Heights and Majuba, and went on to become a very prominent transport rider. I don't think he was a man who ever had much by way of means. There were times where he would assemble some livestock, some oxen, some horses, and then lose them all, often on account of disease, and have to start again. But I was hoping that you might enjoy a little insight into the life and times of a tough Natal lad, George Chops Mossop, a reference to his book and the life that he led, fortunate enough to survive and live to the grand old age of 68 when he was finally called to rest. Thank you very much indeed.